Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. Damien, you're up this week.
Yes.
What are you bringing to the table today?
So I have brought two pieces from The Forge to the table for us to talk about today. Both of them were published earlier this month, or last month, I should say, in The Forge's latest issue, which is titled Right to a Roof on Climate, Crises, and Care. And so the first piece, which is the feature story of the issue, is called The Climate Movement Must Be a Movement Against Fascism. It was written by Aru Shiney-Ajay, who is the executive director of the Sunrise Movement, which is an incredible organization that's working on the front lines of climate and environmental justice. And the second piece we read for today is called Solidarity is the Solution, and it was written by Jeremiah Smith. Jeremiah serves as the director of organizing with the Freedom Project Network and is also an organizer and board member of the Memphis Tenants Union, which is something he talks about in his piece. And these were both really great articles. Aru's piece offered some really pointed wisdom around what our political movement and organizing work needs to understand and focus on in order to engage in and fight for climate justice amidst the fascist times we are currently living in. And then Jeremiah's piece is really a case study exploration of the connections that exist between the fight for housing justice and the fight for environmental justice locally in Memphis. And it hammers home how important it is for those movements and organizers to understand that there is a connection there in all of that work. And so I hope that this would be the case before I read these, and it was, but I thought both of these pieces worked really well together to showcase the importance and necessity of standing and working in solidarity across our movements and across our fights for justice, whether that be housing justice or climate justice, as these two pieces focus on. But I would also argue that same logic could be applied to all of the various manifestations of our movements and our fights against fascism and for our collective liberation. So yeah, I enjoyed these pieces. I'm excited to chat with you about where do you want to start?
Yeah, I thought these offered really clear direction for how to tackle the intersecting violence of our current iteration of oligarchical capitalism.
Yes.
And leading into fascism, right? And thinking about Mussolini, really thinking about how fascism is really just corporatism.
Yeah.
And so seeing all of those things come together in our current manifestation of that. And there's a lot of clarity, too, of how all the structures are connected. They talk about that in both of these pieces.
Yeah.
So it's not just that Sunrise Movement can focus on environmental justice without also understanding how that work is in danger due to the fascist creep of the Trump regime, and how environmental justice is also closely tied into racism through things like environmental racism, which we talked about the coinage of that term not too long ago during an episode of Eyes on the Prize.
Yes.
And, in Memphis, talking about housing justice tied into the greedy, underhanded ways that city governments are making deals with large tech companies to give them sweetheart deals, really, for land and development to build these data centers while seeing our utility costs increase as we subsidize them in a variety of ways. And we also see the toxic fumes increase from the ways that they operate. And so I think these articles both lay things out in a real clear way for how movement organizations have to work together because they're all working to address issues that are ultimately connected.
Oh, absolutely. And I love the fact that you use the word clarity there because I think that's a great way to describe what both of these articles are trying to offer us and to our movements, especially given just how heavy the times that we live in are. But that clarity is also important to help ensure that our movement work is as effective as possible and is sort of firing on all cylinders. And so I appreciate that. One of the things I really appreciated in Aru's piece was the naming of the fact that while climate change is this urgent, pressing issue, we can't solely focus on our organizing for environmental justice without fighting against fascism, as you alluded to. And so Aru offers 4 points of action that highlight what the fight should look like. So the first is non-cooperation, which is this idea that Trump's authoritarian assault must be slowed down directly. And it's going to take all of us, from those in power, in our judiciary, and all forms of our government, to everyday normal people, to engage in that non-cooperation and work to stop it. So that's number one. The second action is moving the public against fascism. And Aru says this about that action, quote, "Fascism succeeds because it identifies real problems that people care about, and it promises easy solutions. We must show the people who saw real populist appeal to Trump's empty promises that he is nothing more than a grifter using them for his own wealth and power, and that he has no intent to solve their problems, and actually that he is responsible for those problems." Absolutely yes to that.
Yeah.
The third action is growing the movement, which is all about working to engage the people who oppose Trump but aren't actively organizing, haven't found their space to do that, and working to help them figure out how they can make a difference in the work and where they can, as we've talked about before, get in where they fit in. And then the fourth and final action point that Aru offers is pitching an alternative. And Aru says this about what that means, quote, "People are dealing with real problems in their lives. The political and economic establishment refuse to acknowledge this, and that lack of acknowledgement is exactly why Trump has succeeded. It's not just climate change. Housing prices are spiraling out of control. Generative AI threatens to radically reshape the job market and end so many people's careers. Political violence has so many people on edge. We need a political movement that understands these problems and has real solutions to them. In each of our single issues, we need to become those movements, or soon we won't have the right to organize politically anymore." And so I loved those. I wanted to share those points that Aru offered because I think they encapsulate that clarity that you talked about earlier, and again, how we can ensure that our movements are as effective as possible.
Yeah, I think those 5 points that she offered, the 5 actions, were really remarkably clear.
Yes.
I think just to give, here are things that we can all do in different ways, both organizationally, but also individually. It's a blend of all of that. Which was great. One of the things that really stood out to me from Aru's article was when she said, quote, "But in 2025, the door has been kicked down. With Trump's onslaught on our democracy and communities in full swing, the strategy simply isn't enough. It feels naive to be building towards big climate legislation in 2029 when we don't even know if we will have free and fair elections in 2026. Ooh. Even though climate change has never been more urgent, it's hard to argue we can organize for climate action or any issue without pushing back against authoritarianism now and hard." And I think that's so crucial to note. We can't stick to our individual issues. We have to see how they're interconnected and all under threat by fascism. If there aren't elections in 2026, then how can an organization that's working toward a Green New Deal actually do that work?
Right.
And so there's an inherent existential threat that has to be reckoned with and organized against by everybody.
Yeah.
Not to mention the ways that the Trump regime is attempting to roll back any and all environmental protections, and the ways that that is connected to unfettered capitalist exploitation and racism.
Absolutely, yes, and the ultra wealthy and sort of making them even more wealthy, and that kind of stopped me in my tracks. The free and fair elections in 2026, I was like, oh no, and so we're just living in truly scary times right now. And in a lot of ways, and we talked about this before, a lot of this administration is so unpredictable too, right?
Yeah.
And so again, for me, the clarity, and I love that you use that word again, the clarity that these pieces offer and the call to action to work in solidarity across our movements to fight the authoritarianism we're facing right now is so important and such a huge takeaway for me from these pieces. I'm going to switch gears to the other piece, Jeremiah's piece. He really talks about solidarity in the context of what's taking place in Memphis as a case study. So he talks about how in 2022, residents of this HUD-subsidized apartment complex organized a tenants union to fight against the slumlord owner of that complex because for years, residents were dealing with mold and broken appliances, non-functioning elevators, no hot water, the list goes on. And residents would face harassment or even eviction for speaking up and speaking out against that. So, that led them to create this union. And then as another example, Jeremiah shared how just this year, Elon Musk announced plans to build the world's largest supercomputer in South Memphis. And the construction of that supercomputer meant the installation of methane gas turbines that spew toxic fumes and smog throughout the neighborhood. And Jeremiah names how both of these examples of how the ultra wealthy and corporations and the city, as you mentioned, are exploiting and poisoning the low income residents of this community, and how this is a clear example of how and why the fight for housing justice and climate justice are connected.
Yeah.
And we need, and how we need to see them as connected struggles. And so I wanted to share a bit of wisdom that Jeremiah offers to organizations engaged in the fights for housing justice and environmental justice, because I thought it was spot on. So he says, quote, "For too often, our organizations miss these connections. Navigating scarce capacity while struggling against giant corporations, it can seem both easier and more practical to, quote, stay in our lane. And yet, even when we do manage to win our fights, we see these gains slowly rolled back or a new threat emerges to replace our old opposition. In fact, much of that logic that guides our organizations is the logic that we hear on the doors. Some tenants pride themselves on keeping to myself or minding my business. But just as the organizer struggles with members to gradually expand the aperture of their concern, helping them to see that they can only really transform their conditions through building collective power and transforming the systems that create their individual conditions, so too must we escape our organizational silos and understand the connections between our struggles in order to build the power we need to win." And again, I just thought that was really incredible wisdom and clarity about what's necessary in this fight and what's necessary moving forward in this work.
Yeah, I think that was a really powerful article. And he goes on to talk about the way that housing and environmental racism are super entwined.
Yes.
And continues that analysis. He says, quote, "These issues, housing and environmental racism, are deeply connected. Renters living with mold in HEHF subsidized properties and residents in Boxtown breathing in toxic fumes are fighting for their lives against the same exploitative system. When people don't have political power and are segregated into certain neighborhoods, the owning class feels emboldened to treat renters and residents as disposable in their pursuit of profits. In order to fight back, we need to align our movements and target the mechanisms that subsidize corporations exploiting the public for profit and the politicians who control them." And so we see in this article both in the environmental disregard for Boxtown in Memphis and the way that the slumlord rental management company treats their buildings. It's extraction without regard for the consequences.
Yes.
Or consequences be damned, really, because they don't add up to anything.
Right.
And they'll pay the fine and they'll move it along because the fine is just the cost of doing business.
Absolutely.
And so Elon's focused on his data center and supercomputer, and the slumlord is focused on the rent checks. And as long as both of those things keep moving, there's nothing that's going to stop them from doing either whatever it is that they want.
Right.
And so they're both polluting people, whether it's mold in the apartments or toxic gases released by these turbines to power the data center.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're banking on the fact that people feel powerless and aren't savvy enough or working together to fight against it, to stand up against it. And so, yeah, it was really such a powerful article to see the connections there that he makes. And again, both of these pieces worked so well, I think, in tandem to tell that story.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's shift our conversation over to application. So how do these pieces and our conversation about them apply to our everyday lives and work? My application comes from something that Aru said in response to the fact that Trumpism and fascism are on the rise, and she focused on what organizers and organizations need to do in response to that. So she says, quote, "If we stay in our issue lanes and organizational boxes, we're cooked. In these times, every movement organization needs to ask itself, how are we undermining authoritarianism and building a movement that can engage in mass non-cooperation to grind Trump's regime to a halt? This doesn't mean we suddenly stop talking about our issues or running our campaigns. It can't mean that. But it does mean that we can't judge our work on the same old single issue metrics of success." And again, I just think that's such a really important takeaway from both of these pieces, actually, for organizers and organizations to hear and to learn from and to act on and to sort of evolve as the threats that we face clearly have been evolving as well.
Yeah, that's great. I think people have always had clear analysis of how things are connected, but tying that into the metrics of success changes the game.
Absolutely.
I think, for people in a lot of ways. One of the other things I think is important learning from Jeremiah's article is that fascists are creating sacrifice zones. So he says, quote, unless we can build collective power and solidarity to meet this moment and to fight the authoritarian advance, we will be helpless against it. As the authoritarian right uses its control of the federal government to create sacrifice zones across the U.S., scrapping regulations, eroding rights, funneling public resources to subsidize the ultra-wealthy, and expanding the police state, it is more urgent than ever that we work to articulate a set of basic and inextricable rights to clean air, clean water, and dignified housing, and that we get into alignment to fight for a future where organized communities make decisions about where we live and how we live.
Wow.
I think that's a perfect way to describe this.
Yeah.
Both the end point where we're organized and we have a say in what happens to us and what happens to our neighborhoods, but also the flip side of this, of the beginning of that, talking about sacrifice zones, because it's the opposite of the opportunity zones that neoliberal governments have promoted. And it's not the opposite in application, it's the opposite in language.
Yep.
And it lays bare, I think, what those places have actually been.
Right.
Those opportunity zones have been opportunities for wealthy to extract more money from the opportunities of the poverty in those areas. And so this is a different language to describe the same thing that tells the truth about what those things have been this whole time. And so I really appreciated that, and also appreciated this vision of articulating a set of basic and inextricable rights to clean air, clean water, and dignified housing. I think that's also, it feels so crucial, particularly in the wave after wave of threats we see to ourselves and our neighborhood and our families and our friends and all of our people.
Absolutely.
So, these are areas that have been seen as disposable because the land is so cheap. Governments will allow things to happen that normally they wouldn't allow to happen because they want to see an increase in property taxes and want to see an increase in value. And these people claim that it'll happen. And so,
but at what cost?
At what cost?
Yeah.
At the disposal of a lot of humans.
Absolutely.
And I think, I appreciate Jeremiah's vision for a different way that we do things.
Absolutely. I love that. All right, well, let's talk about homework now. What do we want to do to continue our learning and unlearning work once we leave the table today? I'd love to dig into the work of the Sunrise Movement and learn more about what they've been up to. The Sunrise Movement is the organization I mentioned that Aru is the executive director of. And so I'd love to see what victories they've achieved lately and what organizing work they've done at both the local level, like in states and cities, but also, of course, at the national scale as well. What about you?
My homework is from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights.
Okay.
They were linked in this article, and they're keeping track of the civil rights rollbacks that the Trump regime has been implementing, which you can look at chronologically, or you can focus on a specific issue area in their archive, so to speak, of what they've been tracking. And so reading through this, I think will give me a better idea of all the things this regime has been up to, because I haven't been able to keep track of it all. So I got some general ideas of what they've been doing as we follow the news and pay attention to it all. But there's so many things that there's also stuff that I have known and have forgotten because of all of the things that are happening constantly. So just seeing it all in one place, one, I appreciate the work that they're doing to keep track of it. And two, it's an important service for at least myself to just keep track a little bit more, to know what we're losing so we can get it back one day.
Absolutely. Well, this was the first I had heard about it in reading these pieces. And my gut reaction to you wanting to do that for homework is that how infuriating it probably will be to actually click through that and to learn about it. And as you say, what are the things we've forgotten because it's just been an onslaught of nonsense and horrific things. But you're absolutely right. I think it's amazing that they have done this and they're keeping track. Yeah, so we'd love to check that out too. So I love that homework. Well, that's our conversation about these articles in The Forge. And again, this is from their latest issue. So there's a lot more pieces in it. Sure, we'd love to check out, and hopefully you do too. But Aaron, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I'm bringing part 4 of our Inquest series.
Oh, yeah.
This one is called Organizing the Already Mobilized. And as a reminder, this is a conversation between Lydia Pellet-Hobbs, Judah Shept, Craig Gilmore, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And this article is about, quote, people involved with labor justice, grassroots community building, and independent watchdogs make obvious allies for abolitionists. But how do we win them to our cause?
Oh, wow.
So I'm looking forward to learning more from this fantastic series. It ties into these conversations we've been having today about how single issue campaigns aren't necessarily the way forward anymore.
Right.
And so understanding, and they've talked about it too with environmental justice and prison abolition. And so tying together all of these things of understanding, okay, these are all the people doing work. How do we get them on board with tying in some abolitionist movement work into the stuff that they're doing, the issues that they're working on, and helping them understand the analysis of how it's all ultimately connected.
Yeah, no, I love that. I've loved this series. It's been so informative and brilliant. And so I'm excited for us to keep it going in our next episode. Very good. All right, well, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life, follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.